We're going to spend a bit of time talking about lameness, and really my argument is lameness is underestimated as far as an effect upon particularly ourselves, and hopefully it's going to support some of the innovation center research that's being done. It's sort of interesting that lameness control is considered an innovation after we've been struggling it for years and years and years. But it's become a focus of research and also interventions on a number of farms, and I'm going to share some of those results and observations with you. I'm arguing that we often treat the sow as a mechanical entity that breaks down in certain parts. The problem with the sow is you can't replace parts, however, you've got to replace the whole sow, and therefore we get into culling conditions. And normally we get worried about conditions in the feet and legs. We call for lameness. We get worried about ovary conditions and uterus conditions, in some cases milking, mammary glands as well. And one of my basic arguments is going to be, as Lori said earlier, as we take a look at culling and replacement and longevity, it's highly unlikely that reproductive problems cause lameness. You have to describe that to me, how that can occur. But lameness can cause reproductive problems, and we're going to show some of that today. And it's a lot bigger relationship than we ever thought. When we got started about a dozen years ago, we got into it because Sam Baydou at University of Minnesota had a unit comparing sows in ESF on fully slotted floors with sows in stalls. And we just started seeing more lameness in the ESF system than the non-ESF system, than the stalls. And we phoned up our colleagues in Europe and said, have you seen this? You're pushing this a lot. And they said, oh yeah, you kind of get over it after a while, was sort of the answer. Or else you should use straw, was always the other answer as far as canned systems. We couldn't do either of that. So then the next step was, let's send a grad student out to do a literature review. There wasn't much, and there's a little bit more each year, as far as studies on lameness in sows. Little is published. If you go to the dairy cow literature, they produce a proceeding about this thick every 2 years on cow lameness. And so our question was, why is there a difference between sows and cows? And we invited in actually dairy lameness experts into the barn to start discussing it. And first of all, we found out was that they do most of their examination of lameness at time of moving into the milking parlor. Of course, we don't get that occasion in our case. And secondly, they trim feet and measure the lesions on the feet and create great publications on that part. They asked, where's our lameness records? And we didn't have any, except at culling. And that didn't make sense for studies, because we actually want to examine lameness and then what happens to the animal afterwards. And we didn't have that in our production records. It doesn't make sense looking at the end and saying, what happened beforehand? We don't know when lameness started, what's going on there, and so we didn't have very much to do. There were very few diagnostic regimes. No one really agreed on what lameness was, and we had scales out there from a 1 to 8 scale to the regular, is it lame or isn't she lame? And we'll talk a bit more about that. Few interventions were available. Most common intervention by far is culling, still in our industry. We get rid of it. We get rid of our failures. And it wasn't tested. How do you test that what you do is correct as far as culling when she's gone? We don't know whether it was the right decision or the wrong decision. And we pat ourselves on the back and complain about the quality of the replacements. The big difference between sows and cows actually came down to the fact that you get half a replacement per cow on average per year. one heifer every 2 years. In comparison with sows, we have lots of replacements available. And thus there's a better ability to replace and bury our failures. And the other big difference was in dairy herds and into the dairy industry, there was an emphasis on lameness and welfare codes. I was part of a group that actually took a look at welfare codes, and up to half the weighting for the welfare of dairy cows was focused on lameness. And in sows, it was close to 2, 3, 4% weighting. So we started looking a bit more. Why is lameness important? I'm going to emphasize a few basic parts. Number one, look for, in terms of welfare, look for harsh interactions with the environment. Is there a more harsh interaction than feet and concrete? Maybe hot weather and the air. You can argue in some cases other nasty sounds and socialization cause some of the same reactions and injuries, but that harsh interaction is definitely there. It's a common site of functional inhibition of pigs. When are pigs not doing what they're supposed to be doing? Should they be walking? Should they be breeding? Should they be eating? And the answer is they should be, but they're not. Often the reason is because they're lame. In our reviews of criticisms of welfare of pigs, it doesn't show up as a common criticism in the written reports. But when videotapes of sow herds show up on the internet, often it's downer and lame sows that show up as a criticism of the way we work. And the other attractive part for us was, hey, it's relatively evident. It's a measurable problem. And there can be responses to our interventions. It should be relatively easy to research and monitor. We've discussed quite a bit about lameness then, and we had to decide what we were going to call lameness and what we were not going to call lameness. And we, a number of years ago, we had this meeting and we went through all the way from, met with the dairy vets and talked about an 8-point scale. And I said, no, I don't want it that big. I want to analyze it easier and easier. I got it down to a 3-point scale. But still I'm convinced for our analyses, especially on-farm evaluation, a 2-point scale is the best. And that's what we're using mostly in our reports. Is she lame? Is she not lame? And earlier we talked about head bobbing and the like, and we also decided to say we're interested in the lameness that's caused by pain. And so for our research purposes, we not only ask, is she lame or not lame, is she trying to avoid walking? And head bobbing or shoulder movement or the like, trying to avoid weight bearing under different conditions is important, and you get the body involved. So gait can be involved, but is she willing to walk? Is she willing to stand in the farrowing crate? And we're starting to do some measurements of ability to stand and eat and drink. One of my concerns all the time are sows that are still drinking when they're starting to sit down. In other words, they should be drinking and stand for a while yet, but they're drinking but they want to sit down. It's a bad diagnostic sign in my opinion. And there's limb pathology. We should be able to find something wrong with the animal at some point. And I like the definition of saying, look for foot lesions and work on them first, and if there aren't any foot lesions and she's still lame, something's going on further up. The other thing we found out pretty early is when we look for signs of lameness, we compared signs of lameness, in this case gait analysis, when they're being moved from gestation to the farrowing crate, and compared to videotaping them entering ESF in a group housing system. And what we wanted to show here is that, that there are lame sows that show up as non-lame when they're being moved. And though what we're calling that is hiding behavior, about 38%, and it stays somewhere around 30 to 40% when we've done this in a few different cases, are what we call hiding that they're lame when they're around people. And it's a very common behavior in hunted animals. The hunters tend to show their lameness. The huntees tend to try hide their lameness because they're the most likely to be eaten. Coming back to the idea of pain, and I use this parallel all the time. If you've had a broken fingernail, it's a painful condition, right? And yet for pigs, they're essentially walking on their fingernails. They're putting pressure on a very sensitive aspect of their digit. And I tend to, Zinpro and others have tried to characterize exactly where the weight bearing is, but this is essentially the end of your finger, and the end of your finger is surrounded by a thin capsule that is sensitive to pain, and injuries in many cases occur. Especially if this crack results in some infection or inflammation underneath that crack. And so in slaughtered animals, you can actually boil the feet at 150 degrees for 20 minutes and pull the capsule off the top and actually see what's going on underneath and find a process in some cases that involves inflammation. And almost invariably, if there is inflammation, there is signs of lameness. Now we've looked at that. Why is that important then? Why is pain important? It's a good question in terms of understanding an organism. One of the first lessons I learned in biology in university was that an organism has 4 basic functions to flourish. They have to feed and take in nutrition. And what's the signal to feed? Hunger. They have to fight. They have to compete and adapt in difficult conditions. And not only fight against other sows, but fight against bacteria, viruses, parasites, people in some cases. In some cases, working across uncomfortable flooring. They also have ability to flee some of those conditions, hopefully. Get beyond them. If they can run to a different point, they can get away from the boss sow and avoid those adverse conditions. And finally, reproduce. They need to be able to reproduce to be able to function. We can argue in each case, and we're trying to show in each case, that for instance, hungry sows that have a painful condition, such as lameness, are less likely to eat. Inflammation on top of that decreases that likelihood even further. They're less likely to fight and win. They can flee, but they need to be able to find those positions and involve themselves in that. And more we're finding that lameness inhibits reproduction. And I'm going to show that as well. Just in terms of welfare, Stan Curtis has argued this for a long time and argued that this is a welfare concern as far as pain and their ability to adapt and manage their surroundings. If they're functioning, they should be fine, because most conditions such as hunger and pain are feelings that signal to the sow to find a better situation, to get your food, to avoid a painful condition. And then on top of that, and it's because these affective states are designed in terms of evolutionary biology to drive the animal to do the correct behavior. And what's interesting is they align with other functions as well that suggest not only in terms of behavior, doing the right things or not, and not doing the wrong things, but in terms of physiology, to look after themselves. That this is to keep the animal going. But there's arguments time and time again in terms of welfare, is it natural? And my argument would be there's nothing more natural than avoiding pain. And so it should be a welfare concern. So we have compromised pigs that aren't able to do what they should be doing. Pain is a signal to create compensatory behaviors. They walk different, they don't move as much, they don't stand as much. On top of that, in many cases, there's inflammation. It's a broader signal to physiologically compensate. With inflammation, most animals decrease the amount of food that they consume, or in milder inflammation, we're seeing that they consume the same amount, but utilize it in different manners, spending more energy, not on growth, but maintenance of a number of different conditions, and it's going to inhibit reproduction. Sort of philosophical, and then we get down on the ground and ask, are we looking at the right things? One of the first exercises we do then, if there's a concern about lameness, is to pull out a flashlight and start taking a look at feet. And are you comfortable with the quality of the feet that are in your herd? And I'd say 95% of producers express surprise that they're in such rough shape. And these lesions may or not be correlated with lameness, but they certainly are a predictor. The other thing we did was a simple exercise on the farm, and this is about 10 years ago, where we were trying to predict which sow should stay in the herd. Was culling actually the right decision? And we decided to add a measure of lameness. Simply ask when they're going to the farrowing crate, are they lame or are they not lame? And in about 670 sows, 20% were lame, and as far as the single classification. And in terms of the Zinpro score and other scores, I think we're running at about 1.5. That above 1.5, most people are calling them lame. Below 1.5, it's sort of iffy, and we're just saying, if you're not sure, just don't call them lame, so we can gain that separation. What we found was subsequent productivity of these sows in terms of pigs born to the sow was much, much lower than in the case of non-lame sows. And this was due to a combination of lower productivity, higher likelihood of elimination from the herd, and death as well. And the surprising part about this was we have never found a condition of a sow that predicts future productivity with the same level of differentiation. This was a 2 strikes and you're out herd. In other words, return twice, we'll get rid of you. If we, first of all, took a look at lameness and then took a look at 2 strikes and you're out, lameness was approximately 20 times as predictive of future performance as 2 strikes and you're out. And the real secret was the 2 strikes and you're out sows were mostly lame. And it comes back to the comment earlier, a lot of sows are not being classified correctly at culling as far as the primary reason for their removal. And so, in some more details, if we look at sows that stay in the herd, pigs born per day in the herd was approximately 40% less, much less productive. They were more likely and more quickly to be removed from the herd as far as for lame sows. And of course, on average then, subsequent to diagnosis, they spent much less time in the herd. Their replacement rate was higher. And they were more likely to die rather than be shipped to market. as a removed sow. We then calculated the productivity, how many more pigs would they produce over the following year, and it was 10.5 versus 4.1. Pigs produced by the replacement, because these sows were being removed earlier. We needed to compensate for the fact that there were more pigs produced by the replacement in the sow space, and in turn we had about a 4.3 pig difference per sow space per year due to lameness. And it's an observation that we have over time. This isn't a pigs per sow per year problem, it's a herd productivity problem. That replacing these sows causes lower productivity. They're not replaced enough right at weaning with a nice gilt coming in right when they're supposed to be, for two reasons. Number one, they cluster. Lame sows occur together in groups, in a weaning group, and therefore it makes more difficulty to be replaced. And often people try breed them and see if they stick and stay in the herd, especially during the summer when breeding targets can be up and we have more problems. It goes back even further in some of our previous research that showed that non-lame versus lame sows, as far as associated with sow loss and removal, they just don't last in the herd. And that's rightly so. And the real scary herds are the ones that keep lame sows. We think that the major reason for culling sows should be lameness, but it's only when it is diagnosed correctly. And it goes back even further to the fact that we need to find methods that control lameness and previous lesions such as OCD and claw lesion scores. And as mentioned early, in our group housing system, this was the problem that we saw, that the group housing system had much lower claw lesion scores than what we saw in total claw lesion scores in group housing system. And this is bull slats with ESF versus a stall system that was a 26-inch stall. And this is just an example of the system that we have, by no means perfect, and we've been doing things with ESF over some time now, such as pouring concrete on top of slats, which really hurts, but especially in the middle of the pen, because that's where we think most of the problems are. And you're going to hear more presentations over the day, but we really think as much as structure is involved in concerns about the sow, temperament is very important in pen systems. And fighting, agonistic behavior, settling in is an important aspect, because many of the claw lesions we see are after that shoulder-to-shoulder dance when they're fighting in the middle of the pen to get their social order. And so lameness is a multi-cause disease. We have to be worried about productivity. We have to make sure that we have replacement animals to use our space correctly. I'm going to argue it's a central welfare concern on our farms. It makes labor happier, and the logistics of running the farm become simpler as well when we don't have an unstable demand for gilts due to lameness. It has historically been treated by culling, and I'm not saying it's wrong. It hasn't been measured historically, and in most farms the first step to control lameness is measuring it. And the biggest difference we have in measurement to lameness is when we get people to record zeros. I'm not only interested in having you record when a sow is lame, but also make it a systematic part of your evaluation, for instance, when moving the sow to the farrowing crate, because a blank means either it wasn't measured or it's a zero. I need people to put zeros down to say she's not lame. And then record-keeping systems start working and we're guided. It's not well controlled, and we haven't paid enough attention to it. We can go beyond recording lameness and recording claw lesions especially. and understanding which sows don't have claw lesions and may have other systems. And we have found that we're not understanding the claw system that well, but this is an interesting lesion. What's happening here? This is a bit of epidemiology. Just want to show you this. If we measure lameness, and this is an example of a herd, we find that lameness predicts low productivity. A low productivity sow, a lame sow has 3 times the likelihood of being a low productivity, subsequent low productivity sow, as we showed. And if we take a look at the productivity of the replacement and the economics of the replacement, we find that in most herds, in most cases, lame sows should be replaced if you have a good gill to replace her. What's interesting in this analysis for us is this number. It says that low productivity in itself is not a justification to cull a sow. In reality, what happens in most of our herds is that what we're seeing is low productivity is a justification for removing sows with good justification, but it's because we're ignoring the biology behind the reason why she's not productive. And we should be understanding in more detail why are sows not performing as they should, rather than simply saying, if she hasn't performed good in the past, she won't in the future, and that's the reason for culling. I'm going to end with just a couple of observations from my latest favorite statistics book. It's called The Flaw of Averages. And I like it because it came out in paperback and it's pretty inexpensive now. And it fits my Dutch blood pretty well. But they make a couple good illustrative points about statistics. The law of averages state that the state of the drunk on his average position is alive. In other words, and the state of the average lame sow in your herd is alive. And a lot of them are farrowing and doing okay. But the average state of the drunk or the lame sow is dead. She's leaving the herd too early, and the statistics should be not only about the lame sows, the way you see them in the herd, but understanding what happens when you cull animals. And longevity is a concern in sow herds, and in our economic models it's showing up time and time again. The second statement is that what's the most important instrument in the cockpit? A lot of people have said altimeter. What were you going to say?
A pilot.
A pilot. Good point. Let's go beyond pilot. His answer is the windshield. That you can't get beyond looking at the animals and understanding what's going on. There are places, and we need to do a better job of creating instruments for measuring lameness, but let's not forget about looking out the windshield and understanding what's going on the farm. So what can we do better? We can increase sow retention by reducing lameness, improving reproduction. We can stabilize yield requirements with less lameness. Interestingly, in economic terms, what we're seeing as a large benefit of reducing lameness is actually decreased in variation of output out of sow herds. We're just seeing less up and down, and we're meeting weaning targets on a greater basis. Lower gilt production costs, better welfare, and there's an ease of production and logistics as well. If we look at it in terms of money, and we've done some monitoring of economics, most of our benefit is through facility utilization. We get more sows into the same herd. We lower our replication costs, we increase our salvage revenue, our costs, our progeny quality. More and more research is suggesting that progeny quality is going up. We shouldn't be surprised that a lame sow doesn't produce as good a pig as a good sow. She's milking less, weaning weights are down, mortality rates are up. But on top of that, we're producing less gilt progeny that have a higher susceptibility to disease and a lower weaning weight in many cases. and we see some concerns in logistics, as mentioned. Our estimates are coming up with somewhere between $161 and $447 per diagnosis of lameness, as far as an effect upon the revenue of the herd, with very little effect upon the costs. Really big numbers and very comparable to what's been shown in the dairy industry. So I'm arguing for some further balance in the way we look at pigs, look at new technologies in many cases, and we think that there's opportunities. And these opportunities are going to continue to come. What's interesting about the dairy cow is they keep on producing proceedings of an inch, inch and a half every 2 years. They haven't solved it yet. And I'm not suggesting we're going to solve it with one simple change in our farm management systems, but we can change it. Here's the non-infectious sow lameness papers that are occurring over the last few years. In 2013, looks like a bumper crop, and it's thanks to, in part, some of the work being done here in Canada through the innovation syndrome model as well. Last thing I want to mention is that Kokolos says, achievement, you can do anything you set your mind to when you have vision, determination, and an endless supply of expendable labor. And I've had many vet students, graduate students, and postdocs working with me on that, and a lot of the thought going into this is also theirs. So leave it at that.